Welcome to Public Health on Call, a new podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our focus is the novel coronavirus. I'm Josh Sharfstein, a faculty member at Johns Hopkins and also a former secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal with this podcast is to bring evidence and experts to help you understand today's news about the novel coronavirus and what it means for tomorrow. If you have questions, you can email them to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, I speak with Professor Mark Christian Thompson, chair of the English department at Johns Hopkins. Our topic is The Plague by Albert Camus, a book that is more than 50 years old and yet immediately relevant to our experience with COVID-19 and much more. In our discussion, I asked Professor Thompson about why this book hit so hard, even today. I also asked him about the role of literature to make sense of what's happening in these times. Let's listen. Professor Thompson, thank you so much for joining me. It's tremendous to have a chance to talk to somebody who really understands and has taught The Plague by Albert Camus. This is a story about an epidemic of bubonic plague in Iran, Algeria, in the 1940s. And it is so relevant to today that the sales are through the roof. I think it was like 1,000+% increase in sales online of the book. And reading it makes so many things about the coronavirus pandemic make sense to me. And so it's just great to talk to someone who knows this so well. And I just want to start by asking, is this unusual? Has this book been quiet for a long time, or do people find relevance in a lot of different things?
First, thank you for having me on. The book has had a steady readership since its appearance in 1947, ebbing and flowing, so to speak, with any health outbreak. But I don't think it's ever seen such a spike in sales or sudden spike in sales as it has now in response to this unprecedented time that we are living through. It's always drawn strong interest, not just from the literary community, but from a general readership. But that has been primarily for its more universal themes and some of its direct interventions in politics, sociology, and some anthropological concerns that it had, as well as the philosophy of existentialism and absurdism.
So I want to just jump into some things that just brought me right into the book. Like at the beginning, the rats start dying and people kind of dismiss that. And then people start getting sick and people don't think it could be the plague. And then increasingly, more and more people start dying, but still people don't realize the threat that they're under. It takes quite a while for people to realize that things have really changed. One of the quotes is the physician notes that when a war breaks out, people say it's too stupid, it can't last long. But though a war may be too stupid, that doesn't prevent its lasting. Stupidity has a knack of getting its way, as we should see if we were not always so wrapped up in ourselves.
I think one of the code words that Camus is using here is stupidity, standing in for the irrational. So in the case you mentioned at the beginning of the book, rats have appeared and are dying in the streets. It's a familiar sign of plague. There are some early deaths, but it's really not until there's an exponential leap that the measures are put in place that we are seeing some of today. The reason for this is a refusal, or a type of denial, a refusal to believe what's going on, because of a sense of self-preservation and an inability to believe in what seems like an unfathomable enemy at the gates. And this has to do with the irrational quality of human nature, but it has nothing to do with the nature of the disease itself, which is utterly rational, utterly logical, and workmanlike in the way it performs its one task, which is to kill its host. We meet this in the book with a combination of rationality and emotion, that there are two sides to this. The first is, and for Camus, an absolute admiration for the heroism that is shown in the face of containing one's emotions in order to do one's duty. But on the other side, a complete loss of control and a succumbing to the irrational, which is, in a way, if the disease wants anything, precisely what it wants.
Interesting. At one point early on, the narrator says the bare statement that 302 deaths had taken place in the third week of plague failed to strike their imagination, meaning the public's imagination. For one thing, all the 302 deaths might not have been due to plague. Sounds like could have been ripped from the headlines in the United States where people are saying, well, maybe people aren't really dying of coronavirus. It's still that irrationality. People are not seeing what is plainly in front of us sometimes.
Right, and a number of theories are floated in order to try and account for what seems like to the reader a patently obvious reason for what's going on. Any possible out will be taken in order to avoid facing this stark reality. Again, it's only when the numbers jump exponentially that it becomes undeniable, and no further excuse can be given for what is going on in the city. The fear that drives this type of blindness or denial is understandable for Camus, and not just in this novel, but in other works. He's also an accomplished philosopher. But ultimately, one has to do one's duty and one's part in the face of an undeniable horror, which is where we end up by the middle of the novel.
Yeah. After this kind of realization, finally, that the plague is there, there's sort of like a haze that sets in. And part of what he writes about is how people kind of lose their sense of self in a way, that time is suspended. That at one point, he says it's very hard for them to figure out the probable duration of their exile. And the reason was this: when the most pessimistic had it fixed at, say, 6 months, when they had drunk in advance the dregs of bitterness of those 6 black months and painfully screwed up the courage to the sticking place, straining all the remaining energy to endure valiantly the long ordeal of all those weeks and days, when they'd done this, some friend they met, an article in a newspaper, a vague suspicion, or a flash of foresight would suggest that, after all, there was no reason why the epidemic shouldn't last more than 6 months. Why not a year or even more? And I find that now people have a very hard time with the concept that we're not stuck in this place where we are now forever. You know, that things will change, that we will learn more scientifically, we will develop new treatments. People get so, not exactly hopeless, but just sort of stuck. And it seems like that there was this period here. And why do you think he's writing about that? And I wonder whether it partly is to create some room for people to be dealing with this kind of suspended state in different ways.
Right. What we get is a numbness that takes hold through the rote daily activities of an altered lifestyle. And the thing about this lifestyle is that it's not individual at all, as you note. We lose the sense of time because everyone is doing more or less the same set of activities each day, day after day. There are, for Camus anyway, in the novel, really 2 categories of reaction to this sort of timeless numbness, an eternal numbness that sets in, that sort of says, this could just go on and maybe even should go on forever. There is, of course, a type of hunkering down, a sense of duty that one has to simply go on and do one's part in a sense of collectivity as opposed to individuality. The other is a doubling down on one's individuality, an attempt to get back to a sense of normalcy when that's not possible, which for Camus leads to a heightened irrationality. And under conditions of heightened irrationality against such a rational enemy, people start to make mistakes, which leads to a further increase in the potency of the disease being faced.
So quickly mention, I was also struck by how he talks about the individualism of death even being lost, that there are really no funerals. The plague victim died away from his family, and the customary vigil beside the dead body was forbidden, with the result that a person dying in the evening spent the night alone, and those who died in the daytime were promptly buried. Really resonates with coronavirus and just the awful isolation that people are in. And also, I think reinforces what you're talking about, that this is muted, that the way that we normally think of ourselves is kind of starts to slip away.
Exactly, the sense of mourning that we lose in such situations, and which is clearly lost in the novel in our own. It signifies and celebrates to a great extent the individuality of the lost soul. This is something that the plague situation, the emergency initiatives that have to be put in place cannot allow. This sense of individuality is precisely what is lost in the type of lockdown situation that Iran finds itself in, and that to some extent we find ourselves in at the moment. A funeral or any type of acknowledgement of the passing of a specific individual would break that spell that we are under necessarily in order to work together, in order to get through a common enemy or the attack of a common enemy.
So in this space that's created, some things are revealed. And one of the clear points of the novel is that there's a lot of inequality in Iran, and it becomes more obvious as the plague continues. This is a quote where he writes that the authorities had another cause for anxiety in the difficulty of maintaining the food supply. Profiteers were taking a hand in purveying at enormous prices essential foodstuffs not available in the shops. The result was that poor families were in great straits, while the rich went short of practically nothing. Thus, whereas plague by its impartial administration should have promoted equality among our townsfolk, it now had the opposite effect, and thanks to the habitual conflict of cupidities, exacerbated the sense of injustice rankling in men's hearts.
It's of course interesting that Camus writes there that equality should have been promoted because of course, equality breeds a sense of collectivity and community, and to some extent, a loss of individuality. If one says, well, I am neither more nor less than you are, then we are the same, we are equal. Instead, what you see are profiteers taking advantage and really pushing their own individuality and subjectivity. But really what they're doing is they're not necessarily creating new avenues for inequality and oppression. They're revealing what is already there and then exacerbating those conditions by taking advantage of this state of exception. So what we see Camus doing with these types of scenes where he points out specifically the forms of inequality that have taken hold of this city, he's suggesting that the plague situation shows us unadorned, utterly naked, the levels and the types of inequality that we all suffer from. But then he also tries to suggest why that is on a philosophical level, that one is unable under normal conditions to see someone else as they are, as a human being, as equal as themselves. And so it is easy to then dehumanize the other. In this way, there are multiple plagues going on in this city, not just the one that they're facing with the bubonic plague.
Yeah, I want to talk about that some. I think certainly we see with coronavirus the revealing of inequalities that were already there but now can't be ignored, particularly in the profound impact that the virus is having on low-income minority communities around the country. And I think that's something that people, have tried in many ways to not stare right at, but can't avoid it when the death statistics have been coming in. And then, to your point, Camus doesn't stop there, because he talks about, through this character, Tarou, the idea that there are plagues that aren't just the plague. And I want to read a quote from him talking about the fact that, in a sense, there are many of these profound problems in society that we typically ignore. This is what he said. "For many years, I've been ashamed, mortally ashamed, of having been, even with the best intentions, even at many removes, a murderer in my turn. As time went on, I merely learned that even those who were better than the rest could not keep themselves nowadays from killing or letting others kill, because such is the logic by which they live, and that we can't stir a finger in this world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. Yes, I've been ashamed ever since. I have realized that we all have plague, and I have lost my peace." And I think that as we've been confronted with the, additional reality of police violence and racism in that, emphasized by the homicide of George Floyd and the protests, that's another kind of plague. And I think, to me, that these words really resonated, that our society is built on many different plagues.
Yes, the disease itself, as Camus sees it, strikes or is indiscriminate in its nature. However, in its unfolding, in its history, it is highly discriminate because it exploits these types of inequalities that are present already in society and that are exacerbated by the state of exception. Now, that said, the share that we all have in each and every death that occurs, be it from plague or from police violence or from some other related form of social inequality, this is something that has to be dealt with the way it is dealt with in the plague situation, and that is collectively. The plague is coming for each and every one of us. And if one of us fails in our duty to try and prevent the plague, then we have failed everyone, not just ourselves. And so if someone dies from our failure, we are partially to blame for that. And I think what Camus wants is for us to see social inequality in the same way. In a democratic society where we do have the power of the vote, if we use that power, that then leads to further inequality, further misery, further death, then each and every one of us, because we took on that responsibility, is in fact guilty. This is part of what he talks about in a later novel from 1956 called The Fall, which is also well worth reading.
I will definitely put that on my list. I was just so struck by this particular theme at this point in time, where the character also says, all I maintain is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences.
Yes, because when we join forces with the pestilences, we spread inequality, irrationality, and human misery for personal gain. But personal gain also includes, at least at some point, a type of fate that will come to everyone and not just those people we thought we left behind as victims.
Towards the end of the book, the worst of the plague is over. They open the gates to the city, which has just been, has been shut away from every place else in the world. There's jubilation, but you get the sense that people kind of want to go back and totally push this experience out of their mind. He writes that the doctor knew that those jubilant crowds did not know but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. So, there's this tension about people wanting to forget, but the plague and the plagues, as we've been talking about, still always being a threat to all of us.
Right. It's at this moment at the end of the novel that Rio reveals that he has been narrating the story. The narrator, from the literary critical perspective, encompasses not as an omniscient narrator, but as a single point of view through which the reader is able to see most everything that's going on as objectively as possible. Through that narrator, one has a sense of collectivity and community. At the end, when everyone wants to get back to normal, the individuality of the narrator is revealed. He becomes a character, a single person, because this sense of collectivity is now gone as the plague recedes. However, he insists that one continue this sense of chronicle, or chronique is the word that's used in French in the novel, which is to say that in order to remember the lessons that have been learned in the plague situation, those of empathy, sacrifice, community, etc., that one write about them, communicate them. One does this in literature, in personal letters. This is what he means by in bedrooms and on shelves, but also in bookcases, the personal letters that were written, all of the literary outputs surrounding the plague, including, and most importantly, perhaps for Camus, the novel itself, so that we have a living record of what happened and can refer to it whenever we find ourselves in need once again, facing overwhelming inequality, and human misery.
Yeah, it's so important that we think about and remember what's happening now in the right way so that we can learn the right lessons and come together rather than just lapse back to the way things were before.
Exactly.
One last question for you. I can't thank you enough for spending time with us. This is just such a powerful book so many years later. How do you think about the role of literature to help process this difficult time that we're in, or difficult times in general?
Well, in the sense that we were just suggesting, not only does the novel provide us with a type of record of what has gone on in the past in order so that we can form sympathetic ties to the past and to others that we may not have access to in the isolation of a so-called plague situation, a quarantine situation. But what it also does is it attempts to shape that experience so that we are not in a vacuum, in a moral vacuum, as we face together and alone what is happening all around us and inside of us. It's that which is going on inside of us during the plague that we have to grapple with, perhaps most immediately for those of us who are not immediately ill. And the novel helps with that in sorting through these emotions, in helping us to come to grips with our duty, and for helping us to understand what our moral responsibility is to ourselves, our families, and our neighbors.
Well, thank you so much. That is so well stated. And I think this novel really made me think that everyone who is thinking and working on these issues should be not just following the counts of the day, but really thinking in a much broader sense and using literature to help inform how we're able to do what we need to do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Public Health on Call, a new podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Please send questions to be covered in future podcasts to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. This podcast is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Lamare Morales. Audio production by Niall Owen McCusker and Spencer Greer, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.